All right, so today we're going to be looking at India and their unique approach to climate change, especially given their booming economy.
Mm,
We're going to be focusing on excerpts from the Economic Survey of India 2023-24, specifically Chapter 13.
okay.
And I'm already pretty intrigued by the angle that they're taking here. You know, India often gets labeled as this major polluter,
Right.
but at the same time, they're also making pretty impressive strides when it comes to sustainable development. It feels a little bit like a paradox, don't you think?
Yeah, it definitely is a very fascinating challenge, I think. The chapter really highlights India's goal to become, the world's third largest economy by 2030,
Hmm.
which means that obviously their energy needs are going to just skyrocket. So how do they balance that growth with protecting the environment? That's the tightrope that they're walking.
And it sounds like this chapter is not shying away from anything. They're actually kind of going headfirst and critiquing the prevailing global strategy when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, that's right. They bring up this idea of a carbon budget, which is basically the amount of carbon dioxide we can emit globally before we hit dangerous levels of warming. And India's argument is that simply focusing on limiting global temperature rise without considering, who has already used up how much of this budget, that's not the most equitable or effective way to go about it.
So it's not just about reducing emissions overall, it's about recognizing historical responsibility as well.
Exactly. And the chapter also points out that this huge push for renewable energy sources, while obviously important, often overlooks the environmental costs that come with actually producing those technologies. So think about the mining needed for the materials, the manufacturing processes. It's not a zero impact solution.
Yeah, you're trading one set of environmental challenges for another. And actually, Chart 13.2, Energy Intensity of Transition, really highlights just how much energy goes into making these things that we think of as green, like solar panels and wind turbines.
Right? It really challenges that assumption that simply switching to renewables is the, end-all be-all solution. And this actually gets to the core of what the chapter is arguing. They believe that this whole approach really stems from this market society mentality that really prioritizes consumption above all else. And they use a very interesting example, toilet paper. The excessive use of virgin wood pulp when there are so many alternatives that exist. It's a really powerful illustration.
They also call out the energy consumption of all these AI technologies that, everybody's so excited about. And I was actually shocked to read that a single ChatGPT search uses 10 times more energy than a similar Google search.
Yeah. It's a stark reminder that even our digital lives have a very substantial carbon footprint. And it's these sorts of issues that India's mission life seeks to address.
Okay, mission life, lifestyle for environment. Tell me more about India's solution to this global problem.
Well, it's really a fascinating initiative. It essentially encourages individuals to adopt pro-environment behaviors in their daily lives. The chapter highlights 75 life actions, things like, setting your AC temperatures at a more sustainable level or switching to, more traditional nature-based products like bamboo bottles. It's a very individual-centric approach, which really contrasts with a lot of these, global strategies out there.
I imagine those 75 actions cover a pretty wide range of activities.
Yeah,
But is there like a central theme or philosophy that kind of ties it all together?
absolutely. Mission life draws very heavily on ancient Indian wisdom, and it really emphasizes the interconnectedness of nature and human well-being. It's about recognizing that even small individual choices can have a very big ripple effect. The chapter even includes a quote, and I think it really captures this essence. Earth has enough for needs, but not for greed.
Wow, okay, that's powerful. So it feels like what India is saying is, hey, maybe the solution isn't just about replacing fossil fuels, but about fundamentally rethinking how we live.
Right. And what's interesting is that this critique of overconsumption isn't just directed outward. The chapter also examines areas within India where, Western models of development are having negative consequences. For example, the meat production industry.
Oh, interesting. What's their take on meat production?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. So the chapter kind of dives into how this Western model of meat production, which is heavily reliant on feed crops, is actually creating competition for resources that could be used to feed people directly.
Well, I'm not sure I follow. How does meat production compete with feeding people?
Well, think about it. A huge chunk of the world's farmable land is dedicated to growing crops that are then used to feed livestock. And the chapter points out that, something like a third of global cereal production goes to feed animals. And about 33% of all arable land is used for feed crops. So that's a massive amount of land and resources that could potentially be used to grow food for human consumption.
Wow. I never really thought about it that way, but does that mean that they're advocating for everyone to become vegetarian?
Not necessarily. While they do acknowledge the environmental benefits of plant-based diets, their focus is more on shifting away from this like industrialized model of meat production. And they highlight how in India and other parts of the world, there are, more traditional farming practices where livestock are kind of integrated into the agricultural system. So, for example, animals might graze on land that's not suitable for crops, or their feed might come from byproducts of crops that are grown for human consumption. It's a much more, holistic and less resource-intensive approach.
So it's not about eliminating meat,
Yeah.
but it's about rethinking how we produce it
Yeah.
and making sure that it's not taking away resources from feeding people.
Right.
Okay, that's a really interesting take on the issue.
Right. And they argue that shifting to these more sustainable livestock practices could actually free up, significant amounts of land and resources that could then be used to address global hunger. And then they connect this to another area where they see problems with, dominant Western model, and that's housing.
Housing. I wouldn't have guessed those two things would be related. What's the connection there?
Well, the chapter argues that as countries develop, they often adopt this sort of Western ideal of nuclear families living in individual detached homes. And this leads to what we call urban sprawl, where cities just kind of spread outwards with these low-density housing developments. And that pattern comes with a whole host of consequences.
Yeah, I can see how that would lead to more energy consumption, more reliance on cars, just more pollution overall.
Exactly. And the chapter kind of contrasts this with more traditional Indian living spaces, which often emphasize multi-generational living, natural ventilation, the use of local building materials, all things that reduce the environmental impact.
It's amazing how this chapter connects all these seemingly disparate areas, like meat production, housing, even our everyday choices, back to this overarching theme of sustainability.
It really highlights how interconnected all of these issues are. And that's where India's concept of mission life comes into play. It's about recognizing that our daily choices, from the food we eat to the way we build our homes, have a very direct impact on the environment.
It sounds like a call to action for individuals to become more conscious consumers.
Yeah.
And to really consider the long-term consequences of their actions.
Absolutely. And the chapter makes it clear that, this shift in mindset also needs to be supported by public policy. So they point to the need for incentives and programs that actually encourage sustainable practices.
So it's a two-pronged approach. Individual action combined with, supportive government policies. So what are some of the specific policies or schemes that India has implemented that align with this mission life?
Well, one example is the Perform, Achieve, and Trade scheme, or PAT scheme as it's known. And this aims to improve energy efficiency in energy-intensive industries. So basically, it sets energy reduction targets for these industries and allows them to trade energy-saving certificates if they exceed those targets. So this kind of incentivizes companies to invest in energy efficiency measures, which ultimately reduces their emissions and also their operating costs.
Oh, that's clever. Using market mechanisms to drive positive environmental outcomes. It seems like India is really putting their money where their mouth is.
Yeah, they definitely are. Another interesting example is the National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture, which promotes things like climate-resilient farming practices, so promoting organic farming, water conservation techniques, drought-resistant crop varieties, things like that.
It's really encouraging to see a country like India taking such a proactive approach to sustainability, especially given the challenges they face with a rapidly growing population and economy.
Yeah, it definitely sets an example for other nations. They're demonstrating that economic development and environmental protection don't have to be at odds with each other.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the environmental impact of meat production to the importance of sustainable housing practices. But we haven't talked as much about what mission life actually looks like in practice for the average person.
That's true. The chapter does delve into those 75 specific actions that individuals can take to reduce their environmental impact. And it's really quite a diverse list, covering everything from energy conservation to waste reduction.
I'm actually really curious to learn more about those actions and how they connect to this bigger picture that we've been discussing. Where do we even begin with 75 different ideas?
Well, maybe instead of trying to cover all of them, we can focus on a few key examples that really illustrate the core principles of mission life.
Okay, that sounds like a good plan. I'm ready to hear about some practical tips for living a more sustainable life. So we talked about the big ideas behind mission life, but like where the rubber hits the road. What are some of these 75 actions that people can actually implement?
Yeah, so, they cover a really wide range, but I think if we pick a few examples, we can illustrate these core principles we've been talking about. So, for instance, under the theme of saving energy, there's an action about using public transport, cycling, or walking instead of relying on private vehicles.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Less fuel burned, less pollution overall. And I imagine this connects back to their critique of urban sprawl too, right? The creating cities where people don't need to rely on cars for every trip.
Exactly. It's about shifting away from that car-centric mindset that we see so much in the West. Another action focuses on, making conscious food choices. So reducing food waste and opting for more plant-based meals.
Right, which ties into their critique of industrial meat production too. It's not about forcing everyone to become vegetarian, but it's about recognizing the impact of our choices and making more sustainable ones.
Exactly. And there's another action that I think is particularly interesting, especially given India's cultural context. It encourages people to adopt a more mindful approach to their digital lives.
Oh, like being aware of the energy consumption of our devices and online activities. I have to admit that ChatGPT statistic we talked about really made me think twice about how I'm using technology.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even these seemingly intangible things like our digital habits have a real-world impact. And Mission Life promotes, simple steps like reducing screen time, turning off devices when not in use, even deleting unnecessary emails to save energy.
I love how they're kind of weaving traditional wisdom with these modern day challenges. It's not just about adopting the latest green technology, it's about shifting our mindset and embracing a more mindful way of life.
It really gets at the heart of what sustainability is all about. And I think
Hmm.
that's what makes India's approach so refreshing. It's not about imposing a one-size-fits-all solution. It's about empowering individuals to make choices that are good for the planet and good for their own well-being.
This deep dive has been so insightful, to really challenge my assumptions about climate change and open my eyes to a whole new way of thinking about sustainability. It's not just a technical problem to be solved, it's really a fundamental question about how we want to live and interact with the world around us.
Yeah, and I think what's so inspiring about India's approach is that emphasis on, individual action and personal responsibility. Like we don't have to wait for governments or corporations to make the changes. We can start making a difference in our own lives today.
So as we wrap up, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that sustainability is not about deprivation or sacrifice. It's about finding ways to live a fulfilling and joyful life that's also in harmony with the planet. It's about recognizing that our choices matter and that we all have the power to make a difference.
Beautifully said. And who knows, maybe some of our listeners will be inspired to check out Mission Life for themselves and see how they can incorporate some of these actions into their own lives. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.